Bray Road runs north through the dark without any light to mark it except the single cone moving ahead of a car. There are no street lamps along the rural stretches of this road. There are no commercial signs, no lit parking lots, no gas station glows sitting at the tree line to give the eye something to calibrate against in the distance. There is only the asphalt itself, a narrow two-lane strip running through Walworth County, Wisconsin, and the headlights of whatever vehicle happens to be on it, and the brief illuminated world those headlights make as they travel forward and then leave behind. From the driver's seat, the road resolves itself only a few car lengths ahead at a time. The gravel shoulder appears, pale and fine-textured against the darker field edge, and then the beam moves on, and the shoulder goes back to nothing, and the next few feet of road come forward to take its place. The rest of the world, the fields, the tree lines, the sky, sits just past the edge of what the headlights reach, present but unlit, the same quiet darkness in every direction. The town of Lafayette surrounds this road. It is a township in the agricultural lowlands of Walworth County, working farmland and woodlots and scattered rural homesteads, spaced far enough apart that driving from one to the next takes long enough to feel the distance. There is no commercial development along Bray Road itself. No storefronts, no business signs, no buildings with exterior lighting left on overnight. The road connects the fields to each other and to the county roads beyond them, and it does this without ceremony, without infrastructure, without anything that would make it remarkable on a map or in a conversation about where to find something worth looking at in southern Wisconsin. Elkhorn sits roughly 1 to 2 miles to the west, the county seat of Walworth County, a small city of around 10,000 people with a traditional town square and a courthouse that anchors the center of it. Elkhorn has its own quiet distinction. It carries the designation of Christmas City of the North, a regional identity tied to its history of holiday tradition, and its downtown has the settled, unhurried quality of a county seat that has been exactly what it is for a long time. From Bray Road on a clear night, the diffuse ambient glow of even a small city might just reach the western sky above the tree line as a faint lightening of the overcast, but the road itself receives none of it. The distance is enough. Whatever light Elkhorn produces at night stays with Elkhorn, and the fields between hold their dark the way fields in flat agricultural country hold their dark, completely, without variation, as if darkness were simply the natural state of the ground, and light were the temporary condition, requiring explanation. A farmstead stands somewhere to the east, a lamp at the end of a gravel driveway, casting amber light onto the stones close to the house and the first few feet of the drive beyond it. The house is set back far enough from the road that the lamp does nothing for the asphalt. The light it makes is the light of a specific place, a specific property, a circle of visibility that ends well before it reaches the county road. Between the amber pool at the end of that driveway and the passing headlights of a car on Bray Road, there is a stretch of unlit ground that the two light sources together do nothing for. The asphalt there is the same as the asphalt anywhere else on the rural portions of this road, at night, dark, unmarked, visible only to the car already on it, and then only for the seconds the car requires to pass through. Standing still at the road's edge in October, looking south along the asphalt before any car comes, the eye finds very little. The road is slightly lighter than the fields on either side, the pale mineral surface of the asphalt catching whatever ambient starlight manages through the cloud cover and returning it weakly. The field margins on both sides are the same depth of dark, neither closer nor farther from the road in any perceptible way, without something to gauge the distance against. The tree line at the far end of the nearest field is a slightly darker mass against a slightly lighter sky, the kind of distinction the eye makes only after it has been given time to adjust and is still not entirely certain it is seeing correctly. The drainage ditch running along the road's edge disappears into the general dark below the gravel shoulder without announcing itself. There is nothing to hear but the field, the low November wind in the remaining crop stubble, the occasional settling sound of frost-stiffened vegetation, the faint distance flattened sound of a farm dog responding to something a half-mile away across the flat ground. Walworth County sits in the humid continental climate belt of southern Wisconsin, a part of the Midwest where the seasons move through with the kind of authority that shapes everything else around them. Spring arrives with real water and real mud. Summer settles into the long, humid heat that the corn and soybean fields require. Autumn contracts the days visibly and quickly from late September onward, and by October, the contraction is no longer something to track intellectually. It is simply what the afternoon does. The sun drops earlier than the body expects. The temperature drops with it. By October in Walworth County, the thermometer ranges through the mid-20s to the mid-50s Fahrenheit across a given week, and the overcast that dominates the regional sky through late autumn means that even those temperatures arrive without the softening light of clear sky afternoons. The days in late October in this part of Wisconsin are not long days wearing autumn clothes. They are short days, honestly short, with an early twilight that begins before most people have finished with the afternoon, and a darkness that is full and complete by 5 p.m. or before it. In September, the fields were still holding light at that hour, the last of the day's gold sitting in the crop rows and in the pale stubble of the wheat harvest, the sky still open and readable above the tree lines. A month later, that light is gone before it arrives. The hour between 4 and 5 p.m. is the hour of the road's disappearance into its own dark, a thing that happens every day through this season, and that the people who live along it account for in the way rural communities account for all the conditions of the land they farm, as simply part of what October is, as reliable as the frost and the mud and the particular quality of the cold that comes off the fields after nightfall. The harvested fields along Bray Road in late October have a specific character that is worth taking a moment with. Through the summer and into September, a cornfield along this road is a wall of living material, 8-foot stalks standing dense and continuous from the road's edge back to the far margin of the field, the canopy of the crop meeting overhead and producing the near total visual obstruction that is one of the reliable features of a standing corn harvest in full season. Nothing is visible at the field interior from the road. The crop holds its own space, its own greenness, its own sounds and movements, entirely separate from the road running alongside it. By late October, the harvest is complete, and the field is something entirely different. The stalks are gone. What remains is the stubble, pale-cut stems standing a few inches above the turned earth, in rows that extend from the road's edge straight back to the tree line at the far end of the field. The rows are visible even in low light because the pale stubble catches what little ambient luminosity there is and holds it against the darker soil between the rows. Looking west across a harvested cornfield along Bray Road's western edge on an overcast October night, the field is open. There is no obstruction, no wall of standing crop, no dense green mass absorbing the available light. The stripped rows extend flat and exposed to a tree line at the far end that sits perhaps a quarter mile back, a dark low mass on the horizon. The drainage ditch at the field edge has its line of cattail stalks, the summer's brown seed heads dried and split, and catching the frost that settles on flat open ground in the still early hours of November mornings, their outlines visible against the paler sky in the last moments before full dark arrives. The drainage ditch in late autumn is a specific thing worth looking at on its own terms before the light goes entirely. Running alongside the road's edge in the flat terrain of Walworth County farmland, the ditch collects the agricultural drainage from the fields and carries it slowly through the flat ground. By November, the water level is low, and on still mornings the surface carries a thin skim of ice, not the thick hard ice of deep winter, but the translucent first ice that forms overnight in shallow water when the temperature drops into the mid-20s and holds there until the sun rises. The cattail stalks at the waterline stand straight in the still air, their brown heads at the top catching the frost that settles out of clear cold nights onto every horizontal surface close to the ground. The frost on the cattail heads is white against the dark water. The ice on the ditch surface is clear, barely there, a suggestion of glass laid over the slow dark water underneath. By the time the frost is visible on those cattail heads, the road has been in its winter light regime for weeks. The ambient quality of the dark along Bray Road changes through the season in ways that are difficult to describe precisely, but that the eye registers nonetheless. The summer dark, on those occasional clear nights when the road was empty and the fields were still green, had a softness to it, the dense vegetation absorbing sound and holding warmth, the sky on clear nights open and generous with starlight. The October dark is harder, the fields are open and cold, the sky is usually overcast and low, and the wind that moves across the stripped stubble moves across it without obstacle. The dark that comes down on a late October afternoon along this road is not the rich dark of a warm summer night. It is a flat, cold, open dark, the dark of wide agricultural ground, with nothing tall enough to hold it back. A car moving north on Bray Road on one of these October evenings carries its light ahead of it as a moving cone, the two beams converging in the middle distance to a point that the road approaches and passes through, and then the car is somewhere else, and the beams are pointing somewhere else, and the road behind the car is dark again. The headlights illuminate the gravel shoulder as the car moves, the pale, fine-textured gravel appearing in the beam and then dropping out of it as the car passes. The field margin appears, the stubble rows, the ditch edge, the first few feet of open field, and then the beam is past it, and the field margin is dark again. The reflective paint of the center line catches the beam and holds it briefly, the long interrupted stripe of white appearing ahead and passing below the car and disappearing behind. For the driver, the road is whatever the headlights make it. For the road, before and after the car passes, there is only the dark. There is something particular about the quality of the Walworth County overcast in late autumn that makes the road at night feel narrower than it is by daylight. The overcast in this part of Wisconsin through October and November is not always a single uniform gray blanket. It can carry depth and variation, low cloud with occasional texture, layers that move at different speeds when the wind is up. On the nights when the overcast is total and low, the sky above the fields is simply the absence of any specific light, rather than a defined ceiling, a quality of lightlessness that makes the distance between the road surface and wherever the sky begins feel undetermined. Looking up from the road's edge on such a night, there is no visible horizon to establish where the field ends and the sky starts. The tree line at the far end of the harvested field is somewhere out there, present by implication, rather than by visible evidence. The Walworth County Fairgrounds sit a few miles from the road, quiet and closed in the off-season. In August, the fairgrounds carry the full density of a county fair at the height of summer, the grandstand filled, the midway lit and moving, the animal barns occupied, the entire complex alive with the specific noise and warmth and activity that a county fair in the agricultural Midwest produces for its brief annual duration. In November, the fairgrounds are none of that. The grandstand stands empty, its seating pale and cold in the low light. The midway is a series of vacant spaces where the fair rides are gone, the ground still carrying the compressed earth pattern of a season's heavy use, but otherwise returned to the plain field it was before the fair arrived and will be again until the fair returns. The barn doors are closed. The parking areas that were full to capacity in August are empty and open to the sky. The fairgrounds in November have the quality of a place that holds its summer identity in storage. The scale of what it becomes for that 1 week a year, visible in the permanent infrastructure, the grandstand, the barn roof lines, the layout of the grounds, but the life of it entirely withdrawn. This is the wider world the road sits in, the county seat a mile or two to the west, the fairgrounds a few miles to the south, the farms and woodlots and homesteads distributed across the flat agricultural ground, and connecting them all the county roads, including this one, Bray Road, running north-south through its particular stretch of Lafayette Township with no commercial development and no streetlights, and nothing along its rural length to suggest that anything about it is different from the dozens of other county roads that cross Walworth County's farmland in every direction. And in the practical sense of infrastructure and land use and daily purpose, nothing is different about it. It is a narrow 2-lane asphalt road connecting fields to other fields, a route for farm equipment and local traffic, a strip of pavement that exists because people needed a way through the agricultural land, and this is one of the ways they made. The name on the county road sign belongs to the family whose land it historically ran through. The asphalt shows the same seasonal deterioration that all rural county roads show, the frost heaves and the shoulder erosion and the patch repairs that accumulate over years of freeze-thaw cycles in a climate with genuine winters. The road is ordinary in the fullest sense of the word, what makes it worth taking this long a look at before anything else is considered is the specific quality of what ordinary looks like here at the particular moment when the headlights of a passing car sweep across the gravel, shoulder, and the field margin, and the road edge on an overcast October night. And the brief illuminated world the headlights make is the only light anywhere on this stretch of road, and when the car has passed, the darkness is total again, and the stripped cornfield runs flat and open back to the tree line, and the ditch ice is there at the road's edge, even though no one can see it, and the cattail heads hold their frost in the still air above the slow cold water, and the amber lamp at the end of the farmstead driveway, a quarter-mile away, makes its small circle of yellow light that reaches no farther than it reaches, and the road is dark between that farmstead light and the next moving car, and the next moving car after that. The October overcast that sits over Walworth County through the late autumn nights does not lift cleanly or quickly in the mornings. Often it holds through the entire short day, the sky remaining a low, dense, uniform gray from the hour when enough light bleeds through it to distinguish the sky from the tree line until the hour when that distinction disappears again, and the sky is simply part of the general darkness. On those days, the sun is present only as a slightly lighter area in the overcast, a diffused brightness somewhere to the south that moves without drama across the sky and drops without fanfare below the horizon, before anyone who works outdoors has quite finished with the afternoon. The fields on those days are the color of the sky, the same flat, low-contrast gray-brown, the stubble rose and the turned earth receiving the overcast light and returning it at the same dull register. Everything is visible, nothing is bright, and the visual world is compressed to a narrow tonal range in which the difference between the road surface and the field margin and the sky above them is a matter of slight variation rather than genuine contrast. On those days, nightfall comes less as a transition than as a completion. The light does not drop dramatically from a clear gold-lit sky into sudden darkness. It simply continues to diminish, the narrow tonal range of the overcast afternoon compressing further and further toward its lower end, until the residual daylight is no longer enough to make the distance between objects readable, and the fields are dark, and the road is dark, and the sky is dark, and the distinction between them is gone. This can happen at 4:45 in the afternoon in late October. The clock that regulates the interior light of a building or the time of a school's dismissal says afternoon. The outside world says otherwise. A month before, in late September, in the first week of October, this same hour was still daylight in Walworth County. The fields were still holding their summer crops or the fresh stubble of the early harvest, and the last of the afternoon light was still gold on the field surface and on the road's pale asphalt, and there was enough sky visible above the horizon that the day's end was a gradual, observable, warmly lit event. A month later, at the same hour, the fields along Bray Road are dark, and the sky above them offers nothing. The difference is not a matter of a few minutes' adjustment. It is the difference between a landscape that is lit and a landscape that is not, arrived at over the space of 4 weeks, the change happening incrementally each day in the small increment of a few minutes less light, until one afternoon the driver heading north on Bray Road at 4:50 p.m. turns on their headlights, not out of caution, but out of necessity, and the cone of white light moves ahead of the car through a dark that is already full, and the harvested fields on either side of the narrow asphalt run back from the road edge in their pale rows to the tree lines at their far ends, which are not visible from the road, which are simply out there in the dark, the way everything along this road is out there in the dark. Once the daylight is gone, the cold that settles over the stripped fields after nightfall in late autumn has a specific quality, a flat, still, slightly damp cold that comes off the open ground and moves with the low wind that crosses the fields without obstruction. The standing crop that held the summer warmth into September is gone, and the soil that the crop roots held and shaded is now exposed to the sky, and the sky is the overcast November sky that carries its cold downward without interruption. Walking along the ditch edge in the hour after full dark, which in late October is the hour after 5 p.m., the cold registers first in the face and in the hands, and then in the feet through the frozen ground. The cattail heads above the ditch ice are still in the windless cold. The ice on the ditch surface reflects nothing in the total dark, but is there, present, doing what ice does in the still water of flat country drainage ditches. In the first weeks of a Wisconsin November, the road continues north through this cold, through this dark, through the stripped fields and the empty woodlots, and the occasional distant farmstead light. It continues past the section where the gravel shoulder is broadest, and past the section where the tree line comes close to the road's edge on the east side, and then retreats again as the woodlot ends and a field begins. It continues past the driveways and the mailboxes and the field access tracks that open briefly onto the asphalt and then are left behind. The road is not long, as roads go. It does not cross a county or reach toward a city. It runs through its particular stretch of Lafayette Township farmland and ends, as rural roads do, at another road, and that road goes somewhere else, and this road stays where it is. By the third week of October, in most years, the change has settled into place. The fields are stripped, the sky is low, the nights are genuinely cold and genuinely dark. Driving north on Bray Road at 4:55 in the afternoon on an overcast day in the third week of October, the headlights are on because they need to be on, not because the sun has finished its visible arc below the horizon. The sun, such as it was on an overcast day, finished that hours ago, but because the light that the overcast was admitting all afternoon has finally reached the lower end of what the eye requires, and the road ahead, without the headlights, is not reliably there. The gravel shoulder is not reliably there. The field edge is not reliably there. The asphalt is a dark surface, moving under a dark sky, through a landscape that is entirely dark at an hour when a month ago it was not yet dark at all. The narrow cone of white light moves ahead of the car. The gravel shoulder appears in it and passes through it and is gone behind the car and is dark again. The pale stubble rows of the harvested field appear on the east side, running back from the road edge toward the distant tree line. The drainage ditch appears on the west side, its cattail stalks catching the beam for a moment, their dried brown heads white in the headlights for the second or two the car requires to pass. The amber lamp at the farmstead driveway ahead resolves from a faint, warm smudge in the dark to a specific point, and then to a small circle of yellow light on stones and frozen ground. The farmhouse behind it is a dark shape against a dark sky, its windows unlit or lit dimly from inside. The house set back far enough from the road that it belongs to its own small world, separate from the road's world. The two pools of darkness between the farmstead light and the moving headlights of the car belonging to neither. The car passes, the road goes dark, the fields are dark, the sky is dark. Walworth County has reached the end of an October afternoon at 4:55 p.m., and the way it reaches all its late autumn afternoons, completely, without gradation, the dark coming down onto the flat, open agricultural ground, the way it has come down on this ground for every October in the long ordinary record of this place, and the road still there, under it, still running north through the dark, still present even though it cannot be seen, simply waiting for the next set of headlights to come through and make it briefly visible again, and then let it go. Lorianne Endrizzi was driving along Bray Road in 1989 when her headlights found something at the edge of the asphalt. She slowed. The figure was large enough and upright enough that her first reading of it was human, a person, she thought, crouching or kneeling at the roadside, the way someone might crouch if they had stopped to look at something in the gravel. She brought the car down to nearly a stop. The light settled on the figure more fully as the distance closed, and what she had read as a person began to resolve into something that was not that, had never been that, and could not be made to be that, no matter how she arranged the details she was looking at. What Endrizzi described, when she later put the account into words, was a figure roughly 6 feet in height, covered in coarse fur, with a face that was unmistakably canine, a long muzzle, wide-set eyes that caught and held the headlight beam in the particular way that reflective tapetum does, and large pointed ears set high on a broad head. The shoulders were heavy. The forearms, she noted with some care, were proportioned in a way that struck her as unusual. They held a quality she associated more with human limbs than with an animal's front legs, something in the length and the angle of them as they rested against the ground. She did not stay long. The car moved past the figure and continued on, and Endrizi continued with it, carrying an account that she would eventually deliver to a reporter working out of a community newspaper in Delavan. The detail of the reflective eyes appears in the account with a specificity that is worth dwelling on for a moment. Tapetum lucidum, the reflective layer behind the retina that produces eye shine in nocturnal and crepuscular animals, produces different colors depending on the species and the angle of the light source. Witnesses who encounter animals at night from a moving vehicle almost always note the eyes first, because the eyes appear before any other feature is resolved by headlights moving through darkness. Endrizi noted the eyes. She noted what they looked like. She noted what the face looked like when it was fully in the light, and she noted that the figure she had initially classified as a crouching person had, by the time her headlights were squarely on it, reclassified itself entirely, without her help, into something she had no existing category for. Doris Gibson was driving the same road in October of 1991, when the event that would eventually bring the Bray Road accounts to wider attention began with what felt, in the moment, like a standard piece of road misfortune. Something was in the road. Her car struck it, or struck something, and she felt the impact. She stopped the car. This was an ordinary enough sequence of events on a rural road at night. A deer, a raccoon, something crossing that she had not been able to avoid. She got out to look. What she found when she looked was not a deer. It was not a raccoon. It was a large, upright, dark-furred animal at the roadside, and it was oriented toward her in a way that she described as deliberate, not retreating, not startled in the way a struck deer startles, but present in a manner that suggested awareness of her specifically. Gibson returned to her vehicle. The encounter did not end there, because what she reported next was that something made contact with the car as she drove away, a force at the rear of the vehicle, and then, when the car was examined afterward, scratch marks along the trunk surface. Those marks were documented, they were examined, they were described in the record as consistent with something large, contacting the vehicle from behind, at a height and angle that matched what a large upright animal reaching for the moving car might produce. The marks were not deep enough to suggest extraordinary force, and they were not superficial enough to be dismissed as ordinary road debris. They sat as physical evidence tends to sit in these cases, somewhere in the space between an explanation and the absence of one. The scratch marks on Gibson's car became one of the few pieces of physical material associated with the early Bray Road accounts. Most of the testimony from this period is exactly that. Testimony, verbal and written description offered by people who had been in a specific place at a specific time and had seen something they could not account for. Physical traces of the kind that can be submitted to analysis and measured against known reference points are rare in sighting accounts of this nature, which is part of what makes the marks on the Gibson vehicle a point the documentary record returns to with some regularity. The marks were there. They were photographed and described. What produced them was not established to the satisfaction of any formal investigation, because no formal investigation of that kind was conducted. But the marks themselves were real, and they were documented, and they were consistent with the account the person who had been in the car gave of what had happened. Scott Bray was not a passerby on a road in the dark. He was the landowner whose family name the road itself carried, a man who had daily experience of the physical scale of large animals, who understood what a farm dog looked like, and what a coyote looked like, and what a deer looked like, and who had calibrated his understanding of animal size through years of working with livestock and watching the field margins around his property. In the early years of the 1990s sighting cluster, Bray observed a large wolf-like animal feeding near a pile of dead animals at the edge of his property. He watched it. He had time to assess what he was looking at with the careful and unhurried attention of someone who was on his own land, under adequate light, with no reason to be moving quickly. What Bray described was a creature substantially larger than any dog or wolf he had ever encountered. The fur was thick and rough. The build through the shoulders was heavy in a way that struck him as disproportionate, even against the animal's overall size, as if the mass had been distributed forward and upward rather than distributed evenly along a quadruped's frame. He described the animal as larger than it should have been, which is the kind of description that comes from someone making a genuine comparative assessment against known reference points, rather than someone searching for dramatic language. Bray was not, by any documented account, someone given to dramatic language about rural animal sightings. The animal he described was simply, in his assessment, too large for the category of animals he knew the region to contain. The pile of carcasses near which Bray observed the creature is a detail that appears in the record without elaboration and without resolution. It is noted the creature was feeding, the dead animals were present at the field margin, and then it sits there in the account, doing the work that unexplained details tend to do in documented sightings, which is to make the scene more specific without making it more comprehensible. A large animal at the field edge, feeding in the early 1990s on property in Walworth County, where the autumn harvest had stripped the fields and where late October had already reduced the available cover to stubble and fence line and the occasional standing woodlot. The animal was there. Burley saw it. He reported what he saw. That is the extent of what the documentary record offers on the subject of what Scott Bray observed on his own land. The witnesses who came forward during the 1989 through 1992 cluster were not, as a group, people with any particular investment in the existence of anomalous phenomena. They were teenagers who had been driving a local road at night. They were farmers with practical daily contact with the physical realities of the rural landscape. They were working adults whose encounters had happened incidentally as a function of being somewhere specific at a specific time rather than as the result of any attempt to find something unusual. Several of them were initially reluctant to report at all. The reluctance is itself a detail in the record, not unusual in accounts of this kind, and worth noting not because it vouches for any particular witness, but because it documents the social context in which the accounts were eventually offered. Reporting an encounter with something that cannot be explained on a rural county road in a small Wisconsin county in the early 1990s was not a neutral social act. The people who did report understood, in most cases, that the report would be met with some version of skepticism or amusement. Some of them reported anyway, and some of them reported only after learning that others had reported first. The quiet passage of a name and phone number from one Walworth County resident to another, someone saying, in effect, that there was a reporter who was taking the account seriously and who could be reached, is the kind of small social mechanism by which testimony accumulates in cases like this one. It does not require any formal network or organized community of believers. It requires only the recognition that another person has described something similar, and that there is a channel through which the description can be offered without the person offering it being the first person to have offered something. The reporter in this case was Linda Godfrey, working at the Week in Delavon, and the channel was the one she had opened by publishing the first account and being willing to receive what came after it. What came after it was more of the same. More accounts, more names, more specific descriptions of a specific stretch of road. The animal at the center of all these accounts was, across the independent descriptions, consistent in its broad outline. Upright or semi-upright posture was noted across multiple accounts. A body that could be at the road's edge, in a position that a quadruped would not naturally occupy, with the mass arranged in a way that read as broadly vertical rather than horizontal. The body was large. Witnesses who had calibrated their sense of animal size against known reference points, against farm dogs, against deer, against the wildlife. A rural Walworth County resident encounters with regularity, consistently described a body mass substantially beyond what those reference points accounted for. The fur was coarse and dark, described variously as dark brown or grayish brown, rough in texture in the way that wild animal fur is rough rather than smooth. The muzzle was long and canine. The face, when headlights reached it, was unmistakably the face of a dog-like animal, not a bear, not a primate, not a human, but canine in its structure and proportions. The behavior the witnesses described was perhaps the most consistently noted and the most difficult to account for through the misidentification framework that official responses would later offer. Across the independent accounts, the animal was described as aware, not startled, not retreating from a threat, not behaving in the pattern of a large predator, surprised at a kill site or crossing a road. It was described as oriented toward the observer, as present in a manner that read as deliberate, as though the headlights that had found it were not a surprise, but simply a development in an interaction that was already underway. This quality of apparent awareness, the face turning toward the light, the body remaining still or moving without the flight response that characterizes most large mammal encounters with human activity at night, appears in the Andresi account, appears in the Gibson account, and appears in accounts collected by Godfrey in the months and years following the initial publicity. It is worth being precise about what that consistency means and what it does not mean. The accounts were collected by a single reporter working from a base of community contacts and reader correspondence. Some of the witnesses may have been aware of earlier published accounts by the time they provided their own. The social context in which later witnesses came forward was necessarily different from the context in which earlier witnesses had their original experiences, because the earlier accounts had by then been published and discussed. These are standard considerations in the analysis of testimony clusters of this kind, and they are real considerations. The documentary record does not resolve them, and no one reviewing the Bray Road accounts is in a position to fully account for the degree to which later testimony was shaped by awareness of earlier testimony. These considerations exist alongside the accounts, neither discrediting them nor validating them, simply forming part of the honest description of how the testimony base was assembled. What the considerations do not address is the question of why the same physical details appear in accounts collected at different points in the timeline, from witnesses who had, in the earliest cases, no documented contact with one another. The long muzzle, the heavy shoulders, the eyes that caught the headlights and held them, the forearms that read as disproportionately human-like, the posture that was upright rather than horizontal. These details appear in Endrizzi's account from 1989, which was recorded before any public reporting on the Bray Road sightings had occurred. They appear in accounts collected by Godfrey in the months after her first article ran, when witness awareness of prior testimony was possible, and they appear with the same specificity in accounts that continue to surface in the decades following the initial cluster, from people describing encounters not on Bray Road itself, but on similar rural roads, in similar rural landscapes, in other parts of Wisconsin, and in other states. The parallel columns that a careful researcher would eventually produce, independent accounts laid side by side, their physical descriptors aligned, are the most concrete way to represent what the Bray Road testimony base looks like when it is viewed as a whole, rather than as a collection of individual stories. One account on the left-hand side of the page, dated and sourced. Another account on the right-hand side, a different witness, a different date, no documented contact between the two people who produced them. The descriptors lined up across the columns, the heavy shoulders, noted on the left, the heavy shoulders, noted on the right, the upright posture, noted on the left, the upright posture, noted on the right, the face turning toward the headlights, present in both columns, placed there by two people who had no established reason to be using the same language to describe the same detail. This is not an argument for any particular explanation of what those people saw. It is a description of what the documentary record actually contains when its contents are laid out with some care. The accounts converge on certain details. The convergence is real. What produced the convergence? An actual animal with a consistent physical form, a shared cultural template, operating below the level of explicit communication, some other mechanism not clearly accounted for in either the zoological or the folkloric literature, is the question that the record raises and does not answer. Doris Gibson's October 1991 encounter was in the sequence of events that brought the Bray Road accounts to public attention, the precipitating event. It was her account, the collision, the scratch marks on the car, the physical trace that could be pointed to and examined, that gave the circulating rumors a specific recent incident with documented physical evidence attached. The rumors had been in circulation before Gibson's encounter, and Drizzy's 1989 account was among them, held for 2 years in the informal network of local knowledge before it became part of a formal record. But the Gibson encounter provided the kind of recent, specific, physically anchored account that a journalist working a community beat could develop into a story. And it was the Gibson account that Godfrey began with when she opened her investigation in late 1991. The scratch marks on the trunk of Gibson's car are worth returning to one more time, not to make any claim about their origin, but to note what kind of detail they are. They are the kind of detail that exists outside of memory, outside of description, outside of the processing that all human witnesses necessarily apply to their experiences. The marks were there before anyone looked at them. They were examined by people who had not been present at the encounter. They were photographed. Their location on the vehicle, the height, the angle, the pattern was noted and included in the documentary record. They do not explain the encounter. They do not confirm the account. They simply exist as a physical artifact of whatever happened on Bray Road in October of 1991, and they sit in the record alongside the verbal description that Gibson provided. And together those two things, the words and the marks, are what the record holds. The accounts from the 1989 through 1992 cluster were given by people who were in most cases alone or nearly alone at the time of their encounters, driving late at night on a dark road, standing at the edge of their own property, moving through the October landscape of southern Wisconsin in the particular kind of exposure that late autumn and early darkness and an unlit rural road produce. None of the core accounts involve a group of witnesses corroborating each other in real time. They are individual experiences reported individually at different points in the 2 to 3 year window that defines the primary sighting cluster. The isolation of each experience is part of the texture of the record, each person on their own with what they saw, at the road's edge or the field margin, in the brief window of a headlight's reach before the car moved on and the darkness closed behind it. Scott Bray's account has a different quality than the road edge encounters reported by Endrizzi and Gibson because it happened on his own property and because he had the time and the vantage point to observe what he was looking at with some steadiness. He was not in a moving vehicle. He was not driving past. He was standing in his land's edge, watching an animal feed, with the accumulated knowledge of a man who had spent his life in close contact with the physical realities of the rural Wisconsin landscape. And what he described, with the calm specificity of a person cataloging an anomaly rather than dramatizing a fright, was an animal that exceeded every reference point he had. The size was wrong, the build was wrong, the shoulders were too heavy, the body was too large. Everything he could measure the animal against told him that what he was looking at should not have been what it was. The repetition of that phrase across the accounts, the sense that the animal was simply too large for the category it appeared to belong to, is one of the more durable consistencies in the Bray Road testimony. Witnesses with rural backgrounds, with practical daily contact with large animals, with no particular reason to exaggerate the size of a wildlife encounter in a region where large wildlife encounters are a known and ordinary part of the landscape. Those witnesses consistently described an animal that exceeded the known scale of the largest canine species present in Wisconsin. They were not describing something merely unusual. They were describing something that their own calibrated experience of animal scale told them was not within the range of what the region contained. That assessment appears in account after account, and it appears without the kind of dramatic elaboration that might suggest a witness amplifying for effect. It appears as a plain factual observation by people who knew what large animals looked like and who were describing something that exceeded that knowledge. The weight of those observations does not establish what the animal was. It establishes that the people who described it believed they were looking at something outside their existing categories of reference, and it establishes that belief was expressed in consistent, specific, non-dramatic language by multiple people who arrived at it independently. That is the full extent of what the documentary record supports. It is depending on the framework brought to it, either a suggestive convergence of testimony pointing toward an unclassified animal, a demonstration of how cultural templates shape the perception of ambiguous nighttime stimuli, or something in between those two positions that none of the existing analytical frameworks has yet fully accounted for. The face turning toward the headlights is the image the accounts return to most consistently, and it is the image that carries the most weight in the testimony for reasons that are not easy to articulate, but are easy to recognize. A deer in headlights produces a particular kind of freezing. The animal stopped, rigid, its eyes catching the light, but its face oriented forward or slightly sideways, its body organized around flight that has not yet happened. A large predator caught at a kill site produces a different orientation. The head low, the attention divided between the disturbance and the food. What Bray Road witnesses described across independent accounts was neither of these. The face turned, the body was oriented. The attention was directed toward the observer in a way that read as active rather than reflexive. The animal, in other words, appeared to be looking back. That detail, the face turning toward the headlights, the quality of mutual awareness in the brief moment before the encounter ended, is not something that any of the proposed explanations for the Bray Road sightings has addressed with particular satisfaction. It exists in the record. It appears in accounts from witnesses who had no established contact with one another. It is described in language that is specific and unelaborated, not the language of people searching for effect, but the language of people trying to describe something they had actually seen. And it rests in the documentary record alongside the other details: the height, the build, the fur, the muzzle, the scratch marks on a car trunk in October, forming a composite image that the record holds without resolving. An image built from several different sets of eyes on the same dark stretch of road. The primary sighting cluster runs from approximately 1989 to 1992, 3 years. A handful of named witnesses on a short stretch of two-lane asphalt in Walworth County, Wisconsin. The accounts were taken seriously by one journalist and collected with the kind of methodical attention that produces a documentary record capable of being examined. They were not taken seriously by any official agency, which is a fact in the record, alongside everything else: the accounts themselves, the physical evidence, the convergences across independent testimony. What all of those things add up to is not something the record specifies. The record simply holds them side by side on a rural road in southern Wisconsin in the dark years of early autumn, before anyone had given the question a name. Several people, none of whom had documented contact with one another, drove or stood on the same short road in the same 3-year window and described the same animal with the same details: the heavy build through the shoulders, the upright posture at the road's edge, the long canine muzzle, the eyes that held the light, the face that turned toward them. The details appear in the accounts. The accounts appear in the record. The record does not close. It simply continues to hold what was offered: specific, careful, quietly persistent, the same image returned again and again by separate people in separate cars on the same dark road, adding up to a question that the documents available have not yet found a way to answer. In Delavan, Wisconsin, in the autumn of 1991, a staff reporter sat at her desk at a small community weekly newspaper called The Week and received an assignment she almost certainly expected to resolve itself quickly. Linda Godfrey was a journalist and cartoonist who covered the things that small-town community papers cover: planning commission meetings, local elections, school board decisions, human interest stories about residents who had done something worth a few column inches. The assignment that came to her in late 1991 was to look into some circulating rumors. People around Walworth County were talking, quietly, about something strange on Bray Road. The expectation, in the ordinary rhythm of a community weekly, would have been a short piece, a local curiosity, something that might fill space between the municipal notices and the advertisement for the hardware store on the back page. She opened her reporter's notebook and began to make calls. The thing about that starting point, the absolute ordinariness of it, the desk, the notebook, the modest assignment in a small office in a small Wisconsin city, is that it is precisely the kind of starting point that does not announce what it is. Most pieces of work that end up mattering begin this way. There is no signal at the desk in Delavan in late 1991 that the notebook being opened is the first page of something that will still be adding pages 3 decades later. That is not how these things present themselves. The notebook looks like every other notebook. The first call connects to a person with something to describe. Godfrey writes it down. What she gathered in those early weeks was enough to write the piece. The article was published in The Week in late 1991, and what happened next was the thing that changed the assignment's character permanently. The response the article generated was not the modest, briefly curious response that a local oddity item typically produces in a community paper. Letters came to the Week's editorial office in the weeks after the article ran, envelopes from addresses across Walworth County, some written by hand and some typed, and what they shared was not primarily enthusiasm for the creature itself. What they shared was the characteristic of having waited. Each person who wrote had held their account back, privately, uncertain whether anyone else had experienced something similar, or whether speaking up would bring the kind of quiet social consequence that comes from being the one person in a small community who says something that sounds unreasonable. The article had settled that uncertainty. Someone else had said something. The letters were the second wave, from the people who needed to know the first wave existed before they would speak. This is a particular pattern in the documentation of accounts that witnesses expect will be received with skepticism. The publicly stated report functions as permission more than as news. Once the initial account exists in print, under a byline, in a publication, with a physical address in the community where the events were reported, a different kind of witness comes forward, not the person who had been waiting for an audience, but the person who had been waiting for confirmation that an audience of some kind was possible. Godfrey, as a working journalist, would have recognized the pattern. What she may not have anticipated was how many letters the pattern would produce, or how consistently the accounts they contained would align with what she had already written down. The article was picked up, first by larger regional outlets, then by national media. This is the step at which a local rural report becomes something else entirely, not in its content, which remains what witnesses described on a specific road in Walworth County, Wisconsin, but in its circulation, in the size of the audience, now aware that the reports exist. National coverage of an anomalous phenomena case does specific things to the case. It reaches witnesses in other locations who recognize something in the description. It attracts investigators and researchers who bring different tools and different frameworks. It also attracts the full spectrum of response that national coverage always produces: the genuinely curious, the dismissive, the committed believers, and everyone distributed across the wide range between those positions. What the national coverage did for Godfrey's reporting, practically speaking, was expand the testimony base she was working with, far beyond what a small Wisconsin weekly's circulation could have reached on its own. She kept working. This is worth staying with for a moment. The simple, ongoing fact of the continued work, which is the element of Godfrey's investigative arc that is easiest to state and probably the hardest to sustain. An assignment that was supposed to be short became a piece became a story became a beat became a decade of continued documentation that stretched across the 1990s and into the early 2000s. Godfrey maintained a dedicated tip line, a phone number given to witnesses and published in connection with ongoing coverage, and she answered it on ordinary weekday afternoons when nothing was happening, when the initial wave of public attention had receded and the story was no longer new. The line continued to ring. New witnesses from new locations called. New accounts were recorded. The file kept growing. The Beast of Bray Road, Tailing Wisconsin's Werewolf, was published in 2003 by Prairie Oak Press. 12 years had passed between the first article in the week and the first book, and what those 12 years contained was the cumulative weight of continued systematic collection, interviews conducted and transcribed, tips received and documented, accounts cross-referenced against each other and against the physical geography of the sighting locations. The book was not, in the terms of its publisher or its author, primarily a work of advocacy for any particular interpretation of what witnesses had reported. It was a record, a specific, detailed, geographically anchored record of what a substantial number of people in a specific region had described experiencing, collected and organized by a reporter who had been present and attentive long enough to let the pattern declare itself, rather than imposing a pattern from outside. What a reporter's methodology looks like in practice when applied to a subject like this is worth describing carefully, because it is different from the methodology that either confirmed skeptics or confirmed believers tend to apply to the same material. Godfrey's analytical framework, as documented across her work, centered on cross-referencing physical descriptors across independent accounts, looking for the place where witnesses who had no documented contact with one another converged on the same specific detail. This is a standard journalistic verification technique applied to unusual source material. The detail that appears in one account is interesting. The same specific detail appearing in two separate accounts from witnesses who demonstrably could not have shared it with each other is something different. That convergence does not explain what the witnesses encountered. What it does is establish that their descriptions, whatever the descriptions refer to, did not originate from a single source and spread outward. The convergence is either independent observation of the same phenomenon, independent misidentification of the same or similar ordinary phenomena, or independent confabulation landing by coincidence on the same details. Each of those possibilities is itself a question worth investigating. Godfrey's record is the material that allows the investigation to begin. Hunting the American Werewolf followed in 2006. The scope of the book extended the geographic frame beyond Wisconsin, tracing accounts of similar bipedal canine creatures across a wider range of American locations, and applying to those accounts the same systematic cross-referencing that Godfrey had developed across 15 years of working the Bray Road material. The title chose a particular word, werewolf, that carries a great deal of cultural weight, and that weight is worth acknowledging. Godfrey has written and spoken about this directly, noting that the term attaches to creatures reported by living witnesses with specific physical characteristics, and that the folkloric tradition it invokes is one layer of context among several, rather than a definitive interpretive frame. The word lands differently in a book title than it does in a fieldwork note. What the book contained, beneath the title, was what the fieldwork had produced: accounts, cross-references, geographic patterns, and the persistent open questions those patterns raise, without resolving. Real Wolfmen, True Encounters in Modern America arrived in 2012. By that point, Godfrey had been working the material for more than 2 decades, and the book's scope had expanded again, not just geographically but chronologically, reaching back through historical accounts and forward through newly documented contemporary encounters. The 3 books together represent something specific in the literature of anomalous phenomena, not a single investigation's findings, but a long-form documentary record maintained by one careful observer across more than 20 years of active research, updated and revised as the testimony base continued to grow. Most fields of inquiry do not produce this kind of record on subjects that resist easy classification. The research tends to either resolve or dissolve. The cases either yield to a satisfying explanation or gradually lose institutional attention and drift out of the active conversation. What Godfrey produced is something else, a sustained, methodologically consistent record that remained open because the subject remained open, the file growing not because the researcher lacked rigor, but because the evidence did not stop arriving. There is a particular quality of attention that long-form documentary research requires that is different from the attention that solves problems. Solving a problem requires that the observer find the answer and stop there. Documenting a phenomenon that has not yielded an answer requires the observer to sustain interest in the open question itself, to find the unresolved state genuinely worth continued attention rather than merely a provisional stage on the way to something conclusive. This is a different cognitive and professional posture, and it is not universally understood as research in the institutional sense, because institutions tend to evaluate research by its products, its conclusions, its resolved questions, its explained phenomena. Godfrey's work sits at a particular and somewhat unusual point, a body of research whose primary product is a very carefully organized record of what has not been resolved. The record itself is the contribution. The open file is the finding. She answered the tip line on an ordinary afternoon, several years after the initial reporting. The new caller was from a location outside Wisconsin. They described something on a rural road at night in their own region that carried specific physical details Godfrey had heard before, from a road in Walworth County, from witnesses who had no connection to this caller and no way of knowing what the caller was about to describe. Godfrey wrote it down. She wrote it in the same way she had written down the first account in 1991, specifically, carefully, with attention to the physical details and the circumstances and the witness's reported experience, without adding interpretive weight in either direction. The account went into the file. The file kept growing. This is the rhythm of the work across its full span. The call received, the account documented, the cross-referencing done against what is already in the file, the new detail placed alongside the details that preceded it, and allowed to simply sit there, in alignment or in tension with them, without being forced into a conclusion the evidence does not support. For a certain kind of mind, this rhythm is genuinely satisfying. The accumulation is its own answer to the question of what to do. When a question cannot be fully answered, keep documenting, keep cross-referencing, keep the record as precise and honest as the material allows, and trust that the record will eventually have enough in it to support whatever analysis the future brings to it. What journalism produces, when it is working well on a subject like this, is exactly this kind of record. Not advocacy, not explanation, not the sighting confirmed or debunked. A careful, dated, sourced account of what a real person described experiencing in a real place on a real night, preserved in a form that allows someone else to examine it independently and ask their own questions of it. Godfrey's work on Bray Road spans from the specific accounts collected in the early 1990s through more than 2 decades of subsequent testimony, and the record has the quality of having been produced by someone who understood that her job was the documentation, not the verdict. A reporter's notebook in the archive of a working journalist has a particular texture. The early pages carry the first interview, the handwriting perhaps slightly more hurried, where the account was coming faster than the pen could catch, the marginal notes added afterward when there was time to consider what the witness had said against what others had said before them. Later pages carry later accounts, and the handwriting changes with years, slightly different pressure, slightly different angle. The same basic shorthand evolved across the practice of continued use. A notebook from 1991 and a notebook from 2005 from the same journalist's archive tell 2 different stories about the same subject, and together they tell a third story about what it looks like to stay with a question for 14 years. Godfrey's archive contains many notebooks. It contains the correspondence that arrived after the first article, the tip line records, the field notes from locations visited, the cross-reference sheets where physical descriptors from independent accounts were laid beside each other and examined for the alignments that either appear or do not appear when the work is done honestly and carefully. The Beast of Bray Road began as a physical object, as one article in a small Wisconsin weekly. Then it became a stack of envelopes arriving at the week's editorial address. Then it became a set of notebooks, then a published book, then 2 more books. And through all of that, through the national coverage and the regional attention and the expanded geographic scope of the research, the underlying methodological commitment remained the same as it was when Godfrey opened the notebook in Delavan in late 1991 and began to make calls. Document specifically, cross-reference carefully, follow the convergences where they lead, stop where the evidence stops, keep the file open. A small community newspaper assignment does not typically produce 3 books and 2 decades of continued research. The ordinary version of this story ends with the short piece, the mildly unusual local curiosity, the column inches between the municipal notices and the hardware store advertisement. What made this one different was not, or not primarily, the strangeness of the subject matter. There are stranger subjects that have attracted less sustained documentation. What made it different was the particular quality of what the early accounts contained when Godfrey sat down to read them carefully, and the way the reader response that followed the first article suggested that those accounts represented not a local isolated anomaly, but something with a wider presence in the testimony of people who had not yet had occasion to speak. The letters from those first weeks after the article ran continue to be part of the record. Some were typed, and some were handwritten, and the handwritten ones carry in their particular slant and pressure something of the person who wrote them, someone composing carefully, thinking through what they wanted to say, aware that they were writing to a reporter about something they had not told many other people. Some letters asked whether Godfrey had heard of other accounts like theirs. Some offered additional detail about an experience they had described only partially in an earlier conversation. Some were from people who had not spoken to Godfrey at all before writing, whose contact with the story had come only through reading the article, and who had recognized in it something they had kept to themselves for months or years. These letters are documents in the ordinary sense, physical objects with postmarks and handwriting, and return addresses, and specific language chosen by specific people to describe specific experiences. They are also, in aggregate, a kind of record of what happens when a community of people who have had similar experiences and have had no occasion to discover that similarity suddenly discovers it. The letters are each individual, but the response they collectively represent is social, the brief charged moment in which a private experience becomes shareable because someone else has said it first. Godfrey received that moment in the form of an editorial mailbag, and she wrote down what the letters contained, and she added those contents to the file alongside what she had already collected through direct interview. The research that followed across the 1990s extended the geography and expanded the testimony base while maintaining the same systematic cross-referencing methodology that had organized the initial Bray Road material. Accounts from other Wisconsin locations were documented, then accounts from neighboring states, then the broader national pattern that hunting the American werewolf would eventually map in detail. The expansion of geographic scope did not dilute the specificity of individual accounts. Each remained anchored to its particular location, its particular witness, its particular set of described physical details. What the expansion did was reveal the degree to which the Bray Road cluster, which had seemed initially like a singular local anomaly, sat within a wider pattern of similar accounts distributed across a much larger area of the country, and concentrated as a matter of geographic tendency in the kind of rural terrain that Bray Road itself exemplified. rural roads through agricultural fields and woodlots, narrow asphalt running between stretches of open ground with no commercial development and no street lights, the kind of roads where a single car's headlights are the only artificial light in a wide radius of dark. This is the terrain that the accumulated testimony across all the locations Godfrey documented over decades tended to name as the site of the described encounters. That geographic consistency is itself a data point. Whether it reflects something about the habitat of an unclassified animal, something about the conditions of human perception and misidentification at night, something about the cultural and psychological conditions that shape anomalous experience, or some interaction among all of those factors, the consistency is real and it is present in the cross-referenced record, regardless of what interpretation is ultimately applied to it. The tip line continued to ring through the 2000s and into the 2010s. New callers described roads in their own regions. They described physical details that Godfrey had written down before, from people who could not have known what those people had said. The file continued to grow, not because the phenomenon had been confirmed or explained, but because new witnesses continued to report experiences consistent with the accumulated record, and Godfrey continued to answer the phone and write down what they described. By the time Real Wolfmen was published in 2012, the documentary record Godfrey had built across more than 2 decades of continued work was substantial enough to support the broader cross-regional analysis that the book attempted. The accounts from Walworth County in the early 1990s were still in the file, the earliest interview transcripts preserved in the same folders that had been opened for every subsequent edition. 20 years of accumulation had not changed what those first accounts said. What it had done was place them within a much larger context, a context that neither confirmed nor explained them, but that demonstrated that the experiences they described were not singular, were not confined to one road in one Wisconsin county, and had been reported by people with no shared background or shared connection except the particular kind of road and the particular kind of night and the particular figure at the headlight's edge. The notebook from 1991 is still part of that record. The letters from the weeks after the first article are still part of it. The tip line transcripts, the field notes, the cross-reference sheets, the published books, all of it is part of a single sustained act of careful documentation that began with a community newspaper assignment and never formally concluded because the subject never formally resolved. The file sits somewhere in Wisconsin, the earliest pages inside the same folders they were placed in when the work was new, every subsequent decade's accumulation added to what came before it. Not closed, not abandoned, still holding the accounts in exactly the form they were given, waiting, with the patient quality of all careful research, for whatever question will one day be brought to it, that the accumulated record might be able to help answer. This is what long-form documentation of unresolved phenomena actually looks like from the inside. Not dramatic, not conclusive, not oriented toward a predetermined finding. A reporter's notebook, a stack of envelopes, a tip line that rings on an ordinary afternoon, a file that stays open because the honest answer to the question it was open to investigate is still, after all the careful work, that the question has not yet been fully answered, and that the careful work, despite not having produced a final answer, is not for that reason without value, because the record exists now, specific and dated and cross-referenced, available to anyone who wants to examine it honestly and ask of it whatever question they bring. Godfrey answered the tip line. She wrote it down. The file grew. The question stayed open. a small community newspaper assignment in late 1991, is still, in this sense, still unfinished, not because the research lapsed, but because the subject it was assigned to investigate has continued to offer new material to document. On rural roads in Wisconsin and elsewhere, on dark autumn nights when headlights are the only light for a long way in any direction, and something at the road's edge catches that light for just a moment before the car moves past and the dark closes in again behind it. The phone continued to ring on ordinary afternoons, years after the first article and years after the first book, new voices from new places with new accounts that carried the same specific physical details Godfrey had been writing down since the notebook was first opened in Delavan. She answered, she documented. The work continued in exactly the form it had always taken, careful, specific, methodologically consistent, and open to whatever the next account would bring, on whatever ordinary afternoon the next call would arrive. In the early 1990s, in a Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources office somewhere in the southern part of the state, a duty officer fielded a phone call about the reports coming out of Walworth County. The caller wanted to know what the agency made of the accounts from Bray Road, the large upright animal, the descriptions of size and movement that didn't match any cataloged regional species. The officer's response, as recorded in the public record of that period, was measured and institutional. The most likely explanation the agency offered was misidentification. Under nighttime conditions, on an unlit rural road, a known animal seen briefly in moving headlights could easily register as something larger or more unusual than it was. The comment was logged. The call ended. The afternoon continued in the ordinary way afternoons continue in offices, where the day's business is managing the documented and the known. What the Wisconsin DNR did not do, in the aftermath of that response, was open a formal inquiry. No wildlife biologist was assigned to the Bray Road corridor. No trapping program was initiated. No systematic survey of tracks or physical evidence was commissioned at the state or federal level. The agency had offered an explanation, and the explanation was reasonable as far as it extended. Nighttime misidentification of known wildlife is a genuinely documented phenomenon, and rural Wisconsin contains animals large enough to produce startling encounters under the right conditions. The explanation was offered sincerely on the basis of what was known. It simply was not followed by the kind of field investigation that might have tested it against the specific conditions of the road. That gap between the explanation offered and the investigation conducted is the first thing worth sitting with when the Bray Road physical evidence is considered carefully, not as a criticism of the agency or the officer who answered the phone, but as a simple structural fact about how the case unfolded in its early years. The institutional response was comment, not inquiry. The explanatory framework was named. The framework was not tested in the field against the accounts it was meant to account for. That is where the evidentiary record begins, not with a formal finding, but with a reasonable suggestion that was left standing on its own without the evidence that might have confirmed or complicated it. The suggestion itself pointed to specific animals. Gray wolves were the most commonly invoked candidate in discussions of the Bray Road reports, and there are good reasons why they were named. Wisconsin has a real and well-documented gray wolf population, and that population exists because of a successful reintroduction effort that began in the northern third of the state in the 1970s, one of the notable conservation achievements in the region's recent natural history. By the early 1990s, wolves had been reestablishing themselves in northern Wisconsin for roughly 2 decades. their range slowly expanding from the boreal forest zones of Ashland and Bayfield counties southward through the mixed timber regions of the central part of the state. They are substantial animals. An adult gray wolf in Wisconsin can carry 80 to 100 pounds, stand close to 30 inches at the shoulder, and move with a range and speed that makes nocturnal encounters on rural roads plausible, even in areas where the animals are not commonly expected. The difficulty with the wolf explanation, as applied to Bray Road, is a matter of scale and geography at once. The shoulder height of a large gray wolf, up to 30 inches, is a real and impressive measurement. It is not close to the height described by multiple independent witnesses, who reported seeing the animal rise to a full upright stance. 6 feet of upright height is more than twice the shoulder height of a large wolf. That is not a margin that nighttime conditions fully account for. A figure seen in headlights can be distorted by distance, by the angle of the light, by the sudden compression of a few seconds of observation into a lasting impression, but a factor of 2 difference in scale is a substantial gap. Fact, and the witnesses who described the Bray Road animal included people with daily professional exposure to large farm animals, individuals who spent their working lives around cattle, draft animals, and large livestock, whose capacity to estimate the size of a living creature against a familiar reference point was not that of an urban visitor who rarely encounters large animals outside a zoo. The geographic dimension of the wolf explanation carries its own complication. Southern Wisconsin, where Walworth County sits, is not gray wolf range. The documented wolf population in the early 1990s was concentrated in the northern third of the state, hundreds of miles from Bray Road. A gray wolf appearing on a county road in Walworth County would itself have been an anomalous event, a dispersing animal moving far beyond the established territory of its species in Wisconsin, which sometimes happens as young wolves travel in search of new territory, but which represents an already unusual set of circumstances. Proposing a wolf to explain the Bray Road accounts means accepting, first, that an animal not typically present in southern Wisconsin was present on that specific road, and then accepting that this already unusual animal was misread by multiple independent observers across several years as something substantially larger and differently proportioned than a wolf. Both steps are possible. Neither is straightforward. Black bears were also named in discussions of the reports, and the bear hypothesis rests on a genuinely observed behavior. Black bears do walk bipedally. They rise to their hind legs to forage, to look over obstacles, to orient themselves in unfamiliar terrain, and a bear on its hind legs in a harvested cornfield at the edge of a rural road, caught briefly in headlights, could produce a striking impression of an upright dark-furred animal of considerable size. The behavior is documented. The animal is real. The case for bears as an explanation for at least some proportion of bipedal upright animal reports in rural Wisconsin deserves to be taken seriously as a possibility rather than dismissed. The geography presents the same structural problem as it does with wolves. Wisconsin's established black bear population is concentrated in the northern half of the state, in the hardwood and conifer forests above the tension zone, in the lake country of Vilas and Oneida and Iron counties, in the logged-over transition zones of the central forest. Walworth County is in the extreme southern portion of Wisconsin, in agricultural flatland, well outside the typical southern boundary of established bear range. A black bear appearing near Bray Road in Walworth County would have been a documented regional event independent of any reported creature encounter. No such documentation from the early 1990s exists in the record. This does not mean a bear could not have been present. Dispersing animals travel, and the boundaries of established range are not walls, but it adds a layer to the hypothesis that the hypothesis does not automatically resolve. There is also the matter of posture and movement. A black bear walking bipedally for short distances does so in a manner visually distinct from a creature described by Bray Road witnesses as moving in a sustained upright position, oriented deliberately toward the observing vehicle. Bears on their hind legs have a characteristic movement profile: feet wide, torso upright but squared, front limbs hanging loosely, the posture maintained briefly and then released. The bear is not running upright. It is not moving toward a light source with the kind of directed purposefulness that witnesses described. The bear hypothesis accounts for the upright silhouette and the dark fur and the general impression of large size. It has more difficulty accounting for the sustained orientation and the specific anatomical details: the long canine muzzle, the heavy shoulder build, the arm proportion that multiple independent accounts included. Track evidence from the Bray Road area was collected on multiple occasions during the active sighting period and in the years that followed. The conditions under which tracks were found were almost without exception difficult for precise analysis. Southern Wisconsin's autumn soil, the period during which the sightings clustered, goes through repeated cycles of saturation and freeze as the season advances through October and November. A track impression left in soft, damp field margin soil after an evening rain might be clear for a matter of hours before a subsequent frost pushes the soil's surface texture, rounds the edges of the impression, and begins softening whatever morphological detail was there. By morning, the track that might have been definitive in the hour after it was made can be a rounded, ambiguous indentation that tells a researcher primarily that something heavy passed through. Plaster casts were taken from some of the better preserved impressions. The results that made it into the documented record were consistent with a large canid, the general morphology of the track, the distance between impressions, the depth relative to the apparent mass of the animal, but were not distinct enough to move the analysis beyond the general. A large canid in southern Wisconsin, whose tracks are consistent with large canid tracks, does not advance the inquiry much. The physical evidence was there in the soil. The conditions did not cooperate with the investigators who were trying to read it. That is the simple fact. The track record from Bray Road is characterized primarily by degradation, not fabrication, not absence, but the ordinary difficulty of obtaining clean morphological data from ground that does not hold impressions well. When the weather is doing what southern Wisconsin weather does in October, hair samples were collected from several Bray Road sighting locations over the years. The process was straightforward in its mechanics: material found on fence wire, on woody vegetation at field edges, in places where a large animal might have passed through or under a barrier, gathered, sealed, and submitted to laboratories for comparative analysis. The results came back identifying the samples as belonging to known species, domestic or wild canid material in most documented cases. The laboratory findings were cited in public discussions of the Bray Road case as evidence on both sides of the question, and this is worth sitting with for a moment because it illustrates something particular about how physical evidence operates in cases of this kind. For those who hold that the Bray Road accounts reflect encounters with a known but misidentified animal, the hair sample results are straightforward confirmation. The material collected from sighting locations came from known animals. The animal responsible for the reports was therefore a known animal. The chain of reasoning is clean. For those who hold that the accounts might reflect something not yet cataloged, the same results carry a different weight. Comparative hair analysis depends on reference databases, on the library of known samples against which a new sample is matched. A hair sample from an animal not currently represented in the reference database will be matched to its nearest known relative, which may produce a finding of domestic or wild canid without establishing that the sample came from a known canid species specifically. The limitation is not a flaw in the laboratory work. It is a structural feature of how comparative identification functions. A result that says consistent with a known canid is not the same as a result that says definitely from this specific species. The distinction is real, and the evidentiary significance of the hair sample record depends in part on how that distinction is weighted. Neither reading of the evidence is obviously wrong. That is the honest position. The hair samples identified as known canid material could be exactly what they appear to be: material from the dogs, coyotes, foxes, and other canid species that genuinely inhabit the Walworth County countryside in numbers sufficient to leave fur on fence wire along every rural road in the county. Bray Road is not uniquely inhabited by large canids. It is a rural road in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin has abundant canid populations in every county. The presence of canid hair at a Bray Road fence line proves nothing about the specific animal witnesses described in either direction. It is simply material that was there, identified according to the best methods available, and returned a result that the existing tools could produce. The pattern of the physical evidence, taken together, has a particular character. It is not a pattern of nothing. Tracks were found. Hair was collected. Physical trace material existed at the locations where encounters were reported. The evidence was gathered and analyzed by people working in good faith with the methods available to them. What the physical evidence record does not contain is a single result that moves the case definitively in either direction, that identifies an animal too large to be any known Wisconsin species, or that definitively establishes the specific known animal whose presence explained every encounter. The record stops before either conclusion. The files hold what the investigation produced. What the investigation produced was a set of results consistent with known wildlife and inconsistent in scale and in the specific anatomical features witnesses described, with the specific known wildlife proposed as explanations. A Wisconsin DNR office on an ordinary workday in the early 1990s received a phone call and offered an explanation. The explanation was reasonable. It was not followed by a systematic field investigation that might have confirmed or refined or complicated it against the actual conditions of the road and the actual accounts of the people who had driven it. That is not a conspiracy. It is simply how institutional resources are allocated toward documented problems with established management frameworks, away from reports that fall outside the categories the institution is built to address. The DNR manages deer populations, wolf territories, waterfowl corridors, invasive species. It does not have a protocol for investigating reports of upright bipedal animals on rural county roads that don't match the morphology of any cataloged species. When the framework for inquiry doesn't exist, the inquiry typically doesn't happen. The comment is offered. The file is not opened. The wolves of northern Wisconsin were real and well studied, and hundreds of miles away. The black bears of the central forest were real and well documented, and similarly outside their typical range for the southern counties. The track casts degraded in the cold and the damp. The hair samples came back from the laboratory with results that were informative and inconclusive at once. The explanation offered was plausible as a category and imprecise when measured against the specific details of the accounts it was meant to address. That is the physical evidence record as it stands, not incomplete through negligence and not incomplete through fabrication, but incomplete in the way that evidence in genuinely unresolved cases tends to be incomplete, because the conditions were difficult, the tools had limits, and the question was not the kind that yields to a single definitive test. There is a quality to the gray wolf that deserves a moment of attention on its own terms, separate from its role as a proposed explanation. The gray wolf of Wisconsin's north is a genuinely substantial animal, not as large as some popular conception makes it, but large enough to register as something remarkable when encountered unexpectedly in open terrain. 100-pound wolf moving through the tree line at dusk, its pale winter coat catching what light remains, its shoulder height placing its back well above knee level. This is not a small encounter. People who have come across large gray wolves in Wisconsin's northern counties describe the experience in terms that suggest the animal carries a kind of presence that exceeds its physical measurements. The size is real, the impression is larger. That quality matters in the Bray Road context because it raises a question the physical evidence alone cannot answer. How much of what multiple witnesses reported was the animal they saw, and how much was the experience of seeing it, the specific perceptual and cognitive processing that occurs in the few seconds of an unexpected nighttime encounter on an unlit road, in headlights, at speed, or nearly stopped, with no prepared framework for what was being seen. Perception under those conditions is not a neutral recording process. It is active, interpretive, shaped by what the observer knows and doesn't know, by what the observer has and hasn't seen before, by the specific qualities of peripheral versus direct vision in low light. By the way, a moving light source distorts apparent scale when a stationary object is caught at the edge of its beam. This is not a case against the witnesses. It is a genuine feature of visual perception that applies equally to every human observer in those conditions, including ones with significant outdoor experience. The visual system under nighttime conditions, particularly the conditions of headlight illumination on an unlit road, where the lit zone is narrow and surrounded by absolute darkness, processes differently than it does in daylight. Objects at the edges of the lit zone are resolved by rod-dominant rather than cone-dominant vision, which means they are processed in lower resolution and with less color information. Apparent size can be distorted by the angle of illumination relative to the observer and the object. A large animal illuminated from a low angle by approaching headlights will cast a shadow that extends behind it, which can contribute to the impression of an animal larger than its actual dimensions. These are not hypothetical distortions invented to dismiss the accounts. They are documented features of how human vision functions at night. They also do not fully account for the specific anatomical details that multiple independent witnesses described. Visual system processing low-resolution information at the edge of a headlight cone can produce distorted size estimates and simplified silhouettes. It has more difficulty producing consistent specific detail across multiple independent observers, the particular proportion of the forearms, the specific character of the shoulder build, the orientation of the face toward the light, when those observers have no documented contact with each other and are reporting from separate encounters across a period of years. Perceptual distortion under nighttime conditions is a real and relevant factor in evaluating any account of an unexpected roadside encounter. It is also a factor that has limits in what it can explain. It accounts for some of the discrepancy between what was reported and what the known wildlife record can accommodate. It does not account for all of it. The question that the physical evidence does not answer, and that the explanations offered do not fully resolve, is not whether something was on Bray Road in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Something was on Bray Road. Rural roads in agricultural Wisconsin carry abundant wildlife. They carry coyotes and foxes, white-tailed deer, raccoons and opossums, the occasional large domestic dog moving through at night beyond its property boundary. Bray Road is not unusual in this respect. The question is whether what was on Bray Road in the documented accounts is accountable within the range of what routinely occupies southern Wisconsin's field margins and drainage ditches, or whether the specific combination of features that multiple independent witnesses described, the upright posture, the sustained height, the specific anatomical proportions, the deliberate orientation toward the observer, points towards something the existing catalog of known regional wildlife does not fully accommodate. The evidentiary record does not answer that question. It carries it. The track casts sit in their boxes with their softened edges. The laboratory reports identify canned material in sealed envelopes. The DNR comment from the early 1990s sits in whatever log it was entered into. The officers note that this was most likely a misidentification. The afternoon moving on after the call ended. The gray wolf stands in its northern Wisconsin territory, its shoulder height 30 inches above the snow, real and well documented and far from Walworth County. The black bear rises briefly on its hind legs in the central forest, its upright posture lasting the few seconds it needs, and then comes back down to all fours and continues through the trees. There is something worth sitting with in the specific character of this evidentiary gap, not the dramatic absence of proof, not the lack of a body or a clear photograph, but the more ordinary incompleteness of a record that came close to yielding something definitive and then stopped just short of it. Track casts that degraded, hair samples that identified to the family level rather than the species level, a state agency that offered a framework and did not follow the framework into the field. These are the stopping points of the physical record, and they are stopping points that did not occur because of bad faith or insufficient effort. They occurred because physical evidence in outdoor environments degrades, because comparative databases have reference limits, and because institutions respond to reports in the categories they are equipped to address. The southern Wisconsin night is cold in October. The soil along Bray Road's drainage ditches freezes at the surface before sunrise on mornings when the previous evening was wet. A track that was clear in the hour after it was made, with distinct toe pad impressions and a defined metatarsal spread, is an ambiguous rounded depression by the time a researcher with a plaster mix arrives in the morning light. The evidence was there. The evidence did not hold. That is the physical record of Bray Road in its plainest terms. Material that existed was gathered as carefully as conditions allowed and returned results that were informative and incomplete at once. A plaster cast of a track impression rests in a researcher's hands in daylight, the edges soft where the frost came through overnight, the morphological detail that might have resolved the question already blurred past the point of recovery. The cast exists. It is real. It is the record of something that passed through soft ground near a field margin in Walworth County and left an impression heavy enough to hold for a few hours. What left it, whether it was the large canid that the general shape suggests, or something else that happened to leave a generally canid-shaped impression, the cast does not say. It carries the question in the soft clay of its edges, in the place where the detail was and is no longer, in the space between what the impression once showed and what the freezing night was willing to preserve. The laboratory report on the hair sample sits in a file, typed on standard paper, the finding clear in its language, consistent with a known domestic or wild canid. The sample envelope is paper-clipped to the report, the collection site noted in the margin in a researcher's handwriting. The material is there. The identification is there. The question of whether the identification fully resolves what was present at that fence line when the material was left there, that question the report does not address, because it is not the question a comparative hair analysis is equipped to answer. The laboratory did what laboratories do. The result is what a result is. The file holds it, open, not discarded, not yet resolved into a final answer. The DNR officer's note from the early 1990s, wherever it sits in whatever log it was entered into, described the most parsimonious interpretation of the reports. Known wildlife misidentified at night. A reasonable framework applied in good faith, offered as institutional guidance. The investigation that might have tested the framework against the field never opened. The afternoon moved on. The phone rang again about something else. The institutional record of the Bray Road reports is, in its fullest form, a single comment logged in an otherwise ordinary workday. The file never formally opened because the category for opening it did not exist. That open file, or rather the file that was never opened, is the physical evidence record's most honest summary. Not dramatic absence, not institutional suppression, simply the ordinary gap between a question that a framework was designed to address and the specific conditions of a case that the framework did not fit precisely enough to carry all the way to a tested conclusion. The tracks degraded, the hair matched to the family. The comment was made and not followed into the field. The question the physical record was gathered to answer sits where it has sat since the early 1990s, held in the degraded casts, in the typed laboratory findings, in the institutional note that said misidentification and moved on to the next call. The Bray Road physical evidence is a record of genuine effort, meeting genuine limits. The soil conditions of southern Wisconsin in October did not cooperate. The reference databases of hair analysis did not extend to the specific question being asked. The institutional frameworks of wildlife management did not include a protocol for the specific category of report that the road was generating. None of these failures belong to negligence or bad faith. They are the ordinary conditions of inquiry at the edge of what the existing tools can reach. What remains is what the files contain, track impressions too degraded to resolve, hair samples identified as canid in a region already populated by canids in abundance, a state agency's comment, logged and not followed, a gray wolf at 30 inches of shoulder height in the northern third of the state, a black bear on its hind legs for a few seconds in the central forest. The accumulated physical evidence of the Bray Road case, sitting in folders and boxes and laboratory envelopes, characterized most precisely by what it came close to establishing and stopped short of establishing, useful, partial, and finally quiet, the way all physical evidence eventually goes quiet, when the conditions have done what conditions do to things left out in the cold. Before any road crossed it, before any county line was drawn through it, before any surveyor drove a stake into its dark soil and wrote a number in a ledger, this land was already old in the way that land becomes old only through long, attentive habitation, known at its edges, known at its transitions, known especially in the places where one kind of terrain ended and another began. The ground that Walworth County now occupies was not a single landscape. It was several landscapes pressed together at soft, shifting margins. Oak savanna giving way to wet prairie dissolving into sedge meadow and marsh running up against the drier ridgelines where the oaks stood alone in open grass, their crowns wide and separated the way trees grow when they have had the space and the centuries to grow without competing. The Ho-Chunk and the Potawatomi knew this land through the particular grammar of its transitions. Not the interior of one terrain or another, but the line between them, the margin. The place where the field met the wood, where the cultivated met the wild, where the familiar gave way to the less certain. In Ho-Chunk oral tradition, these threshold zones carried a specific kind of significance. The edge of the savanna, where it dropped into marsh, the tree line, where the grass ended and the shadows began, the drainage corridor, where something might move from one water source to another without ever crossing open ground. These were not simply geographic features. They were recognized as the kind of place where the ordinary rules of a landscape thinned out, where the categories that organized the known world became less reliable, where powerful animal spirits and shape-shifting presences were understood to be most at home. The field margin where corn stubble now stands pale and harvested in November was, 2 centuries before the corn, exactly this kind of place. The edge terrain, the in-between. The forced removal of the Ho-Chunk and Potawatomi from this territory began in the 1830s under federal relocation policies that moved both nations away from the lands their oral traditions had named and organized and inhabited for generations past, counting. By the 1840s, European settlement was well underway. The New England and New York migrants who came to Walworth County in those years found a landscape that had already been shaped by long human presence. Trails worn between water sources, forest edges managed by generations of fire and harvest. The oak savanna kept open by practices that the settlers had no context to recognize as practices. They saw available land. They began converting it. The oak savanna was cleared first, its trees taken for timber, and its grass turned under for the wheat and cornfields that would define the region's agricultural character for the next 2 centuries. Elkhorn was platted in 1836 and incorporated as a village in 1852, its town square courthouse marking the center of the county seat that would eventually be recorded, gently and without particular irony, as Christmas City of the North. The fields that surrounded the county's rural roads, the fields that now flank Bray Road from its southern end to its northern terminus, were established in those first decades of European settlement, their soil broken once and planted continuously ever since, the field margins following the same drainage lines that the Ho-Chunk had known as threshold terrain. The German and Scandinavian families who came to Wisconsin in the latter half of the 19th century brought their own traditions with them, packed into memory and story, the way seeds are packed into a pocket, not always planted intentionally, not always growing into recognizable form, but present in the cultural substrate of the communities they settled into. German folk tradition carried the werewolf as a recognized figure, the human who crossed into animal form under particular conditions, the body that refused to stay within a single category, the creature that occupied the same threshold space in the imagination that the Ho-Chunk and Potawatomi had associated with their own shape-shifting animal spirits. Scandinavian settlers brought the Varulfor from Norse tradition, a figure with the same essential grammar, the boundary crosser, the one who moved between human and animal in ways that the natural order was not supposed to permit. By the 20th century, these traditions had faded from active belief into residual cultural memory, the kind of thing a grandparent might have mentioned once and a grandchild might have half remembered without knowing quite what they were remembering. They were not living folkloric systems. They were sediment, but sediment accumulates, and the Walworth County soil that Bray Road crosses carries more than one kind of deposit. What this means in practical terms is that when the first accounts of something unusual on Bray Road began to circulate in the late 1980s, they emerged from a landscape that had been layered with human meaning for a very long time. Not because any of those earlier layers caused or predicted or explained what witnesses reported seeing. They did not. The Ho-Chunk understanding of threshold terrain is not an explanation for the 1989 sighting cluster, and the German settler memory of the werewolf is not an explanation for Doris Gibson's 1991 encounter. These traditions belong to their own times and their own systems of understanding, and to press them into service as causes of later events would misrepresent both the traditions and the events. What they are, instead, is context, the accumulated human history of a specific piece of ground, the record of how many different people across how many different centuries found something in this particular landscape worth attending to, worth naming, worth placing at the center of a story about what moves at the margins of the known world. Elkhorn sits a mile or two to the west of Bray Road, its population somewhere around 10,000, its courthouse square well maintained and familiar to anyone who has spent time in the small county seat towns of southern Wisconsin. The county fairgrounds occupy a stretch of land not far from the road, and in August they are full, the grandstand noisy with a crowd, the midway lit and running, the smell of fried food carrying across the grounds in the warm dark. By November, the fairgrounds are empty. The grandstand sits quiet against a gray sky. The midway equipment is covered or stored. The grounds have the particular stillness of a place that organizes itself around seasonal use and does not pretend to be anything other than what it is when that season is over, a wide, flat, closed expanse that waits. The contrast between the August fairground and the November one is the same contrast that defines the whole agricultural landscape around Bray Road, the same field that stood golden and heavy with crop in September is by late October stripped to pale stubble and open to the wind, the ground visible and undisguised, the drainage ditches along the road edge carrying their thin skim of ice in the early mornings, and the cattail stalks standing with their brown heads frosted in the cold, clear light. The land does not become different land. It simply shows more of what it is when the growth is taken away. The road itself has a small history that sits inside the larger one. The Bray family, whose name the road carries, are local landowners whose connection to this stretch of Walworth County asphalt predates the sighting accounts by generations. Scott Bray, one of the witnesses in the early 1990s cluster, reported observing something large and unusual near his property during that period, a man whose family had farmed this land long enough that their name became the road's name, standing at his field margin and trying to account for what he had seen against everything he knew about large animals. The road sign at the intersection bearing the family name has, since the sightings became publicly known, been a repeated target of removal by souvenir collectors. Local authorities have replaced it several times. The sign that stands there now is cleaner than its neighbors, its green lettering on a standard county road marker, slightly newer than the surrounding infrastructure, its replacement history encoded in the fresh paint that the earlier signs no longer carry. It is a modest monument to the way a place becomes a location once enough people decide it deserves one, not by any formal designation, not by any official acknowledgement, but by the accumulated weight of attention that begins when enough separate people find themselves drawn to the same stretch of road for reasons that are difficult to explain in full. The attention has been sustained. Every October, visitors come to Bray Road in documented numbers, parking their cars along the narrow asphalt shoulder and rolling down their windows to listen. Their phones light the car interiors faintly, while the road outside remains completely dark. No streetlights, no commercial glow, only the occasional amber warmth of a distant farmstead lamp at the end of a long gravel driveway, doing nothing for the road itself. The field sounds come in through the open windows, wind across the stripped rows, the occasional distant bark of a farm dog, the low creak of a fence post settling in the cold. These visitors are not all operating from the same framework. Some come because they are genuinely uncertain about what the witnesses reported and want to sit in the place where the reports were made. Some come because the uncertainty is itself interesting, and being on the road at night gives that uncertainty a specific, locatable feeling. Some come simply because Bray Road has become a place on the American paranormal map, and the map draws its own kind of traffic. People who want to have been somewhere, who want to have sat in the dark at the edge of a harvested field in Wisconsin and listened to what the field sounded like. All of these are real forms of attention. The road receives them all without distinction. Linda Godfrey has been present at events associated with Bray Road over the years. Her long arc from the 1991 assignment at the Weekend Delavan to a multi-decade role as the primary chronicler of what became known as the American Dogman phenomenon. Fully visible by now, the 3 books on a shelf representing a span of investigative work that began with a local reporter's notebook and a phone and a set of calls she probably expected to conclude in a short column. The investigative framework she developed over those years, direct interviews, cross-referenced physical descriptors, geographic clustering of independent accounts, produced a body of documentation that has remained the primary record of the Bray Road case and the wider phenomenon it belongs to. That record is neither closed nor abandoned. It continues. There is a particular quality to a case file that has been maintained for more than 3 decades. The earliest materials inside it carry the physical signs of their age, interview transcripts typed or handwritten in 1991, reader letters on paper that is slightly yellowed at the edges, notes from calls made before digital record keeping made notes redundant, all of it organized and preserved through a discipline that is specifically journalistic rather than archival. The discipline of someone who made the decision early on that these accounts deserved to be taken seriously and kept carefully, and did not stop making that decision as the years accumulated. The later materials sit alongside the earlier ones in the same folders, the same handwriting appearing across documents from different years, the same cross-referencing methodology applied to accounts collected a decade or 2 decades after the original cluster. A case file like this is a form of argument made not through language, but through persistence. The argument that a question worth asking once is worth going on asking, that the absence of a satisfactory answer is not the same as the absence of a question, that the thing that does not resolve deserves to be kept rather than discarded. The evidentiary record of the Bray Road case has not resolved. The Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources officials who offered their comments in the early 1990s proposed the standard framework of nighttime misidentification of known wildlife and declined to pursue a formal investigation, and their explanation accounts for what it accounts for: the darkness, the vehicle headlights, the stress of an unexpected encounter, the genuine cognitive challenge of identifying an animal seen briefly at the road's edge from the driver's seat at night. The gray wolf that reaches 80 to 100 pounds in northern Wisconsin, the black bear that walks bipedally for short distances, the large domestic dog seen at an angle that distorts its proportions. These are real phenomena, documented and well understood. They exist. They have been seen on roadsides at night. They account for a meaningful portion of the reports that circulate under the general heading of unusual animal encounters. The question that persists, quietly and without resolution, is whether they account for all of them. The hair samples collected from fencing near Bray Road sighting locations came back identified as known species. The track casts taken from soft soil near field margins degraded before precise morphological analysis was possible. The physical evidence record is characterized primarily by what it did not resolve, and that characterization is not a judgment against the investigation. It is simply what the evidentiary record looks like when the evidence reaches the edge of what it can establish and stops there, the file open on a desk and the question still inside it. The Walworth County landscape in late October carries its own kind of argument, one made not through documentation or investigation, but simply through the seasonal reality of the place. The corn harvest is finished by that point in most years, the combines moving through the fields in late September and early October, and leaving behind the stripped rows that extend flat and open to the tree lines at the far edges. The temperature drops into the 20s at night and climbs into the 50s during the warmest days, and the overcast skies that arrive with autumn in southern Wisconsin push the darkness down before 5 in the afternoon, a darkness that falls at an hour when the fields were still lit gold, a month before, the change happening gradually and then suddenly and then completely, the agricultural landscape restructuring itself around an early nightfall that the summer visitor would not recognize. Bray Road sits within this landscape, as it has always sat, running north-south through the open fields and woodlots and scattered farmsteads. The asphalt narrow and dark between its gravel shoulders, no streetlights along the rural stretches, the occasional farmstead lamp at the end of a long driveway, doing nothing to address the darkness of the road itself. The farmstead names along this stretch of Walworth County have not changed much in 4 generations. The mailboxes at the ends of long gravel driveways carry names that appear in the county records from the 1890s, the same families farming the same fields through the same seasonal cycle that their great-grandparents established. The corn rotation and the winter fallow and the spring planting following the same rhythm that the land has carried since the oak savanna was broken and the first furrows were turned. There is something in that continuity that is easy to overlook when attention is focused on the unusual events of the early 1990s. The daily, annual, multi-generational ordinariness of agricultural life on these roads, the way the fields look at every stage of the year to the people who have spent their entire lives watching them, the way a strange thing seen on a familiar road sits differently in the mind of someone who has driven that road twice a day for 20 years than it sits in the mind of a visitor making a single October pilgrimage. The witnesses who came forward in the early 1990s were predominantly local people, farmers, teenagers, working adults whose daily lives moved along these roads without any particular expectation of the extraordinary. Their reluctance to report publicly, documented in several accounts, reflects the specific social vulnerability of claiming an unusual experience in a small community where the same neighbors who would hear about the claim would also continue to be the same neighbors the following morning.
The accounts came forward anyway.
Which is its own kind of fact about what the witnesses believed they had seen. The question of what walks Bray Road at night has been circulating in documented form since 1991. Before that,
It circulated in the form of rumors that preceded Linda Godfrey's assignment, the kind of rumors that pass between neighbors through the specific social channels of a small rural community, mentioned in passing at the hardware store or at a kitchen table,
the kind of thing that almost everyone who hears it files under uncertainty rather than either belief or disbelief. the mental category that holds things that have not been confirmed and have not been dismissed and simply continue to exist at the edge of the known. That rumor channel and the community testimony structure it represents predates any journalism, any formal investigation, any published account. Whatever was being discussed along the Bray Road corridor in the years before Godfrey's first article was being discussed because multiple people in a close-knit rural community had reason to discuss it, reason that came from their own experiences or from the experiences of people they knew and trusted. The journalism made it legible outside the community. The community made it first. A case that has persisted across more than 3 decades without resolution has a specific character that shorter, resolved cases do not have. The unanswered question accumulates a kind of weight, not the weight of certainty, pointing in one direction, but the weight of continued attention, pointing at a space where certainty has not arrived. New witnesses continue to report encounters, by Godfrey's documented account, on a regular basis, not only in Walworth County and not only on Bray Road, but across a wider geography that the American Dogman phenomenon occupies, a geography that Godfrey's research methodology has mapped through decades of cross-reference testimony. Whether all of these accounts describe encounters with the same kind of entity, or with different entities, or with known animals seen under unusual conditions, or with something that the existing analytical frameworks do not adequately address, the documented record does not establish. The record simply persists, and the question persists inside it. And the field margins along Bray Road continue to occupy the same threshold terrain that they have occupied since long before anyone named them or drove past them at night, in a vehicle with its headlights sweeping the gravel shoulder and its driver sitting forward slightly in the seat, attending carefully to what the light showed at the road's edge. The edge of the road at night in late October has a particular quality of exposure. The harvested fields extend away from the asphalt with nothing standing above knee height for hundreds of yards in either direction, the pale stubble rows converging toward a tree line that is barely visible at the far end of the field, the drainage ditch along the road margin carrying its thin skiff of ice and its frosted cattail stalks in the cold morning light. There is no cover here, or almost none. The seasonal stripping of the agricultural landscape has left the field edges open and legible in a way they are not in summer, when the corn stands 8 feet high along the road, and the visibility from the car window extends only a few feet into the wall of green before meeting total opacity. In late October, the driver's headlights reach the full length of the field edge and show everything that is there to be shown at that hour. The pale rows, the empty drainage ditch, the fence posts at the property line, the occasional piece of farm equipment parked in the field for the night, or everything that was there. The light moves and the car moves, and the edge of the illuminated zone shifts continuously, and what was briefly visible in the headlight cone is already behind the car before the driver has fully resolved what they were seeing into a firm identification. This is the exact visual condition under which every significant sighting account from the early 1990s cluster was recorded. Not negligence on the part of the witnesses, not poor conditions of visibility. The conditions of visibility, precisely as they exist on that road, at that time of year, at that hour, something in the long human relationship with this particular strip of land in Walworth County keeps generating accounts that resist the final step of resolution. This is not a claim about the nature of what those accounts describe. It is simply the observable character of the case record, that the reports have continued to come in, that the physical evidence has continued to fall short of definitive identification, that the proposed explanations have continued to account for some portion of the testimony without accounting for all of it, and that the question has gone on being asked by new people who had no prior stake in the asking. A question with that kind of longevity has earned a certain quality of attention, not belief, not dismissal, but the particular attentiveness owed to things that have stayed in circulation long enough to demonstrate that they will not simply go away on their own. The road is still there, the accounts are still accumulating, the field margins are still the field margins, the threshold terrain still occupying the same position at the edge of the agricultural and the wooded, the same in-between zone that multiple traditions across multiple centuries have found worth naming as a place where the ordinary categories become unreliable. In November, the sky over Walworth County comes down low and gray and stays. The cloud cover that keeps the nights dark before 5 p.m. also keeps the days muted. The flat light sitting over the stripped fields without lifting into anything warmer, the temperature in the 20s overnight, and the thermometer moving slowly during the short days, not climbing far before the afternoon light begins to fail again. The road surfaces frost early and thaw late. The county maintenance crews make their rounds. The farmsteads along Bray Road go about their seasonal business, equipment stored, repairs scheduled, the routines of agricultural winter already beginning to organize the days into their colder pattern. The road sign at the intersection bearing the family name catches the frost along its upper edge in the early mornings, the green lettering reading plainly against the standard county marker, the paint clean and recent and soon to need replacement again, the way it has needed replacement before and will again. What persists is not necessarily an explanation. The road persists. The case file persists. The accounts collected across more than 3 decades persist in the same folders that received the earliest 1991 interview transcripts, the latter material settling in alongside the earlier without displacing it, the whole accumulation forming a record that is characterized most accurately by what it continues to hold, rather than by what it has resolved. A file like that has a kind of patience to it. It does not argue for a conclusion, it simply remains, the first pages inside it, as present as the most recent ones, the question that opened it still open, the accounts of what several people reported seeing on a narrow road in southern Wisconsin in the early 1990s, still sitting in the same collection alongside every account that came after, all of it neither proven nor dismissed, simply kept, the way things worth keeping are kept, carefully, consistently, and without an end date. The oak savanna that the Ho-Chunk and Potawatomi knew is gone from this ground now, broken into fields and woodlots, and the paved surfaces of county roads. The ecological edge terrain that their oral traditions associated with animal spirits and shape-shifting presences has been converted into the agricultural field margins of Walworth County, and the drainage ditches run where the wetland transitions used to run, and the fence lines divide what used to be open boundary into discrete parcels with legal identities and names attached to them. But the liminal quality of the in-between terrain does not seem to have gone with the transformation. The same zone, the field edge, the woodlot margin, the ditch line between the cultivated and the less cultivated continues to be the zone where the accounts originate, where the headlights sweep across something at the road's edge, where the driver slows and leans forward and tries to resolve what the light is showing into a familiar category and finds that the familiar categories are not quite arriving. Whether that is because the terrain itself retains some quality that the ancient traditions recognized, or because field margins simply concentrate wildlife at the exact distance and angle that makes identification difficult from a moving vehicle, or because the accumulated cultural history of a place shapes what its inhabitants expect to find there, or because something genuinely unclassified moves along the edge of the agricultural dark in southern Wisconsin on overcast autumn nights. None of these explanations have been established. All of them remain in the file. The file remains on the shelf,